The author of The Synergy Trap. It's a bestseller, sold over 100,000 copies in 6 languages, and it's now available on your Kindle. It's called The Synergy Trap by Mark Sororer. He's a principal of Deloitte. Please give him a hand, Mark Sororer.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much. I think our time is a little bit short, but it's a great topic. I'm going to have to put my reading glasses on here. So I've modularized, which is a word I've been using a lot lately, the way I'm going to run the panel. Just very quickly, I'm a strategy partner at Monitor Deloitte, and I've been doing diligence on M&A strategy and commercial diligence for almost 20 years. So I have a lot of views on the topic of building a life around it. But we have an extraordinary panel, and I have pages of their experience here. So I'm going to just highlight some of it very, very briefly. But you cannot get a better panel like this on diligence. And they cover a broad range of diligence. The title of the session is driving. It's the power of diligence to drive strategic value creation. And so if you think about just what's the words of the title, it's a great title for a session on diligence, but it sort of narrows the scope. Because diligence is everything. You've got strategic diligence, operational diligence, commercial diligence, people, incentives, and culture. And there's operational excellence, and there's international issues, and there's deal breakers, and there's so many different areas of diligence. But this session is really about strategy. Like why would you do a deal? What's your strategy for value creation? What is diligence along those lines? Obviously, if it's about value creation, obviously valuation is a huge issue in diligence, and most of what you do in diligence is going to drive a valuation or test it. And the other part is the creation part. So obviously, what you're going to do with the asset after you buy it has to be a pretty significant part of diligence. So that's going to be just kind of the scope of the way we'll approach this. Why don't I just dive right in and make some introductions, and I'll apologize if I'm shortening them, but we have about 30 minutes. I'm going to try to keep this lively as we go. And I didn't even get a chance to meet everybody. You're going to have to, I'm just going to say hello right here, so I start with your, hi Tim. Tim is Managing Director at Gores Group. Tim is a member of Gores Investment Committee and responsible for leading the industrial vertical, providing portfolio company oversight and leading operational due diligence efforts. In addition, he has served as Chief Executive Officer for 2 Gores portfolio companies. Prior to joining Gores, he was Vice President of Sales and Operations and General Manager of Business Services at Gateway, and he was also with Bain for 5 years before that. And it's Gerard. So Gerard Pico is a vice president at DTZ. Previously, Mr. Pico was a senior vice president at Crescent Partners and the managing director of Moore Partners in New York. With 26 years of brokerage and national portfolio management experience in commercial office, retail, industrial warehouse assets, Mr. Pico specialized areas of expertise encompass portfolio value engineering and consulting, new business development, leasing, and investment sales and sale leasebacks.
Brent.
Thank you. Brent Earls is Managing Director at Allegiance Capital Corporation. Brent has over 20 years of experience as Executive Strategic Counsel to business owners, CXOs, and boards of directors, and experience in macro business analysis, growth strategy, and brand management, negotiation, and overseeing numerous multi-million-dollar contracts. Brent is a published author and ghostwriter of numerous books and articles, including H&R Block's Just Plain Smart book series with Random House reference on tax planning and financial planning. Brent has led senior strategy development at some of the world's best-known companies, including H&R Block, AT&T, 3M, P&G, Unilever, Pennzoil, Motorola, Allstate, Sirius Satellite Radio, and Hughes Direct TV. In his role as strategic advisor, Brent has been involved in a number of M&A activities. I have to tell you, these resumes go on and on, so I'm just trying to highlight who you have today. Greg Bedrosian, so I've narrowed it down so I know who I have left. Greg is co-founder and CEO and managing partner of Redwood Capital Group. He's responsible for the overall strategic direction and management of the firm and takes an active role in Redwood's relationships across the corporate investment communities. Mr. Bedrosian is an award-winning and seasoned investment banker and private equity investor who lived and worked in Europe for over half his 20-year career, and whose experience spans domestic and cross-border M&A and private equity transactions across U.S., Europe, and emerging markets. Finally, Lee Brand, all the way to my left. Lee is founder and chairman of Brand Consulting Group. He's an IRCA Certified Quality Management System lead auditor and a senior member of the American Society of Quality. He's an operations excellence expert. He graduated, since it's early in your resume, I'll tell you, we've got Harvard graduates and Wharton MBAs galore. I'm Columbia PhD, so we have a highly educated panel. Boston University and NYU, where I've taught for the last 20 years. Since the company's inception in 1995, Lee has developed quality assurance training, auditing, consulting services for many of the world's most popular quality assurance and environmental management system standards, and he's worked across a whole variety of industries, so we have a wealth of experience there. All right, so why don't I just jump right in the half an hour that I have, and I'll ask a couple of general questions, and then I have some specific questions for each of you. So let's just start at the top, which is when we start talking about the concept of diligence and value creation, the question often comes up like, well, how is private equity? What are the issues of private equity versus corporates? And what I'd like you to do is just sort of go one by one and say, because my question is always, are they really that different? And I work for both, but I'm just sort of curious your view on what are the major issues that where private equity and corporates have different key diligence issues?
Just as way of context, at the Gores Group, we've got somewhat of a differentiated model as it relates to conducting diligence and the in-house ops capabilities that we have. We don't leverage third parties as much as other private equity firms, and we've got very much a ops orientation towards creating value in businesses that we buy. In some sense, we look like a strategic when we go do due diligence. We've got functional experts across the board that are very deep in their respective areas. We've got leverage finance experts. We are able to get across an asset pretty quickly. And in that sense, we approach it the same way a strategic would. The one difference, I think, is that our team does this consistently for a living, and our subject matter experts probably look at 100 deals or so a year, which is a little bit different than the types of folks you'll run into in a corporate strategic buyer that's looking at an asset. Generally speaking, I think the pace and the speed in which we approach the diligence, the depth in which we go is a little bit different than typically what you'd see with a corporate buyer.
Our experience grew out of need as a third party and service provider. Private equities turned to DTZ to look at assets, leases, and build a strategy. What sets us, I think, apart in that, or the value add, is the research capabilities and the quick response time, as well as having a footprint that's global. So to answer those questions on the front end of a deal, our experience has been that real estate's been a day 4 issue, and our job is to help
pull the screen back or bring visibility into the portfolio as far as risk, cost avoidance, and just building that roadmap to a better outcome or in an acquisition.
Any difference specific private equity versus corporates?
Certainly the pace is different.
Yep.
And the bandwidth needed to do that, to pull that off in a timely time frame, as well as the accuracy. So I'd say those are the two areas that we excel at and that private equity has the greatest need at.
Brandon?
Our firm, Allegiance Capital, works in the middle market and lower middle market, and so the size of the deal can make a difference between a strategic and a sponsored private equity deal, at least from our view. A strategic deal, in a lot of cases, the pace is certainly faster, and they may already have an idea of what they want to do with the asset. They may have outlined 24 to 36 months ahead of time a target or a series of targets that they have in mind for expansion of different lines of business, and so they come to a transaction almost preloaded with the idea of what they intend to do, and may look at the financials in a totally different manner, and have already outlined where they think this line of business might take them. Separately, private equity may be looking for a platform, maybe looking to break into a category where they have some expertise, or maybe interested in a general area and maybe coming into an industry where they have some overall expertise, but in that particular subsector, maybe not as much. And so the need to educate and to do some value creation during the due diligence process may be greater in those circumstances. Again, going back to size of the deal, there's a great deal of difference between a 5 to 10 million EBITDA company and a 30 to 50 million EBITDA company in terms of what they've already accomplished as a business and the very discrete sponsors that come to look at those kinds of deals, which is really overall a very different kind of buyer and a very different kind of transaction. So how value is looked at as a size of deal becomes a critical component in that situation.
Greg, I'm just going to sort of launch into my specific questions.
Sure.
Sort of try to
Sure.
kill a few birds with one stone.
Absolutely.
But you have tremendous international experience, and I'm curious, what are some of the unique diligence issues that arise in international deals, like specific issues? And can you give an example of a country or region-specific issue?
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to do that. And just to put my background and experience of our firm in context, we have two sides to our firm. The core of what we do is M&A advisory, where we're working with the big strategics or the private equity groups on deals, a lot of them cross-border in nature. We also have a co-investment arm where we're co-investing alongside some of those prominent private equity groups. So we have the ability to see through both lenses. On international deals or cross-border deals, it is very country and region specific, but you open up a whole nother layer of issues around tax treatment, employees and how to handle them in terminations, things around intercompany transfers and how, in a strategic sense, if you're going to be acquiring a business, how technically it gets rolled in. There are we do a lot of work in Europe, particularly in countries like France and others. It's notoriously very difficult to fire people, and not that all M&A is geared around headcount reduction, but in many cases we've been involved in transactions where buyers have either lowered pricing or changed deal terms or walked away from deals. I'm speaking about North American buyers, once they dug in to understand the pension costs, ability to fire, and ongoing costs of running a business. So those are definitely things that are different and unique versus a plain vanilla U.S. deal.
Great, thanks. Lee, we talked a little bit about your experience in operational excellence, and I'm curious about what are the things that you do, what are some specific things that you look for in auditing or looking at the operational excellence that can drive strategic value, and actually more importantly, bubble up some things in terms of integration planning pre-deal?
Right, so I'm not sure how many people in the audience are familiar with ISO standards that come out of Switzerland, but it's a group based in Geneva, Switzerland, that comprises almost every country in the world that passes international standards on quality assurance, ISO 9001 being the most popular, environmental management systems, social accountability issues that have been discussed today, occupational health and safety. And what we do would be to, on behalf of a firm, go into a targeted company and conduct an audit against that internationally accepted standard and come back to the firm and say, you ought to think about some of these things because they don't have a management system to address this particular topic, and that might be a no-go or too high of a risk. Or from, you were asking the second part of your question, value creation, they may say, we absolutely think we're going to buy the company, but we want to bring you in at the back end after we bought it to establish such a system. So as part of our exit strategy, it'll make the company that we own more attractive to a potential buyer. And these ISO standards are, to give you an idea, Mark, when I started my company 20 years ago, there was 40,000 registered companies in the world, and today there's 2 million. So it's not going away. People said it was going away then. It's just the way to do business today.
Great. Thank you. Kind of working my way back. Gerard, when we first talked by phone, you mentioned that real estate is often viewed as a day 4 issue. And, given, as you told me, that real estate is the second largest expense for most companies, do you think it's misplaced as a day 4 issue? And just get your views on that, and also like what are you looking for when you're doing diligence pre-deal on real estate?
Well, we see real estate as a lock on equity, whether it's own portfolio or leased or combination. So one of the things we look for is risk, environmental contamination. Is there a sustainability program in place, pre or post? And we look at our value creation as being that key into that lock. So prior to an acquisition, if we're able to put together a roadmap and help investors look at the portfolio through supply chain logistics, mapping out timing to an exit, how long a truck takes to move goods from point A to point B, or a market, if we're able to go through the leases and examine any potential risks with that, any overhang, but also, and I don't want to overstate what we do, but our research capabilities with over 100 people that are in 52 nations and 208 markets, we're very quickly able to benchmark a portfolio. One example that comes to mind is warehouse and distribution assets. First off, the data as you go through pre-acquisition, the data in 125 locations wasn't adequate enough to even do an analysis like that. So we did a snapshot of 8 and penciled out a savings of about $4.4 million. And these are primary leases in central business districts like New York or LA or Toronto. These are $4 and $8 square foot warehouses in the Midwest and the South. So if you blanket or translate that through the rest of the portfolio, just doing 8, and there are another 120 sites to go. I mean, let's do the math. So day 4 issue, if you're in manufacturing, maybe raw materials is your second largest cost. So real estate is probably number 3. Owned assets, coming up with a strategy as far as sale leasebacks, and really positioning the portfolio, hopefully pre-acquisition. We're in a bankruptcy, you can move on or break up that lease or right-size that footprint. So we look at it as a best practices that isn't always overlooked, but we like to think of ourselves as that extra bandwidth to help people make better decisions.
Good, thanks. Brent, you spend a lot of time working the sell side of diligence and representing companies that are selling and obviously trying to get as much for their company with as few restrictions post-sale as they can have. What are some of the things that selling companies can do to improve their valuation before the buyer starts looking at them? I don't know whether that's whether that's doing diligence on themselves to sort of maximize the benefit. I'm curious. What are some of the things that selling companies can do?
Well, it depends a little bit on where they are in a cycle of preparation to go to market and on their size and sophistication. In the lower middle market, a lot of times you lack sophistication but great entrepreneurialism. And they don't know what they don't know, and so getting in as an intermediary early and being able to bring in third-party professionals who can put them in a position to optimize their value is critical. For instance, we've successfully been able to bring in outside CFO services firms. It's not uncommon for some entrepreneurial companies to be very light on their feet and great at growing a business, but not necessarily have the kind of financial controls or financial leadership in place to sustain what can be a very strong due diligence process. Bringing in someone for 3 months, last year we closed a healthcare deal that had a lot of sophistication to it. It was in the heart of Obamacare, very Medicaid and Medicare reimbursement driven, and a lot of sophistication wrapped around how to drive that reimbursement. If we hadn't brought in outside professionals to prepare the company, they would have never been able to have withstood the rigorous due diligence process we had to go through to close the transaction. We maintained the full value of the company, of what we thought we were going to accomplish, had very sophisticated inventory issues, 12 locations, in a very forward-thinking market of growth for Medicare and Medicaid, poised to be able to implement Obamacare and to exploit it, a Medicare winning bidder. And yet at the same time, at the time we took on the transaction, the CEO was writing out his own payroll checks and signing them. A really good example of how entrepreneurs don't necessarily think about what's going to prepare them to take their company to market to optimize value. Have never really managed inventory the way they needed to, so we brought in outside inventory people to help with that. Currently we have 3 companies in due diligence. One of them is a very entrepreneurial retail display company. They have an extremely broad client list. They've narrowed it down, and in narrowing it down, they created for themselves some fairly significant customer concentration. It never occurred to them that customer concentration was going to be viewed as a potential negative when the names on their roster are names that all of us know. They just assumed that that kind of concentration is the kind of concentration anyone would embrace. And so thinking about how to diversify that concentration, not just into other names, but among multiple buyers became a critical aspect. All of that having to be done before we took the company to market, or we would have been at a selling disadvantage, and we would have done a disservice, to our client.
Since we're on this selling company issue, and obviously it's almost the mirror image of what you would do from a buyer's perspective, looking at the seller. One of the things in commercial diligence we spend a lot of time on is the real market growth rate, and any of you have bought a company, you've probably never seen a seller that doesn't have some uptick in their revenue line and their margin line. How do you, given that's going to be attacked by the buyer through their own market diligence, what are some of the things that you can do in anticipation of those challenges? How do you kind of support it, whether it's in the management presentation or the SIM?
It can be done there. When you look at share and growth of share, it's important to look at how fast is the market growing and how fast are you growing in relationship to the market. If the market's growing at a greater rate of speed than your own share, then you're actually losing share. Even if you think you're gaining it, someone else is getting more of the lion's share of the market share than you are. So understanding that first becomes critical, and being able to position that. We've done a lot of sponsored deals in the last couple of years, and I don't really find that necessarily private equity is coming in trying to knock down the value as much as going back to the panel's theme of value creation. They are wanting to understand how to position the company for great growth after they get it. And if the company is in a share dilemma, then what's causing that? What's driving that? And so getting to the bottom of that, and as an intermediary, being able to bring the parties together and getting them to think about the strategy they're going to implement after they close helps the buyer to get more bought in and helps the seller to believe in the partner that he or she is getting ready to sign up with and to move forward with. The sooner you can get that process to begin to happen, of course there's a confirmatory part of diligence, but the sooner that you can get that to happen, the greater the opportunity for a successful transaction, and that the company is actually going to achieve its growth goals and hit that strategy after the deal's done.
Great. All right. Thank you. Let's go back to the buyer's perspective and try to walk into the boardroom a bit. Tim, I didn't quite get to that part of your resume that talks about all the boards you've sat on, but you've sat on many boards and have a lot of boardroom consulting experience. What type of diligence results, and especially red flags, are directors of companies looking for, particularly on material deals that could impact the share price?
Well, tough question for us. I think for us to answer. We've got an investment in a company called Stock Building Supply. We took that business public in August. Changes the game a little bit in the boardroom. The dialogue in the boardroom certainly makes you appreciate the private environment a little bit better. It does drive a more exhaustive dialogue in a public company setting than in the private company setting. But nevertheless, it does change the way you think about follow-on deals and the way you think about your own business. I would probably address your question just a little bit differently, which is whether you're public or private, when you're looking at a follow-on business or frankly any investment, there's a couple things that certainly we look for, and I suspect everybody in the room that is a private equity investor looks for as well. We do a lot of diligence. We pride ourselves on being very exhaustive, but probably the most important thing we can do as an investor or prospective buyer is to develop a very thoughtful and comprehensive point of view on what we would do with the asset if we owned it. And that includes a lot of things, including from a board perspective, how do we add value at the board level, right? If you think about governance and direction, we look to add independents that know the sector incredibly well, that can add value to our team that occupies the board seats. So developing that point of view drives a lot of thinking in terms of the value creation that we can bring to that particular investment. The other element that I touch on, and I see your list of questions that we're trying to get accomplished here. The other thing I
have a lot more.
I
grab that coming.
So much to talk about in so little time, but I'd say the other thing is just understanding what the downside is in that particular investment and how do we protect our capital in a situation where the market or the asset doesn't perform the way that you hope. And those are two big elements of overriding elements of the diligence work that we do on any given due diligence effort.
Great, thanks very much. Okay, so let me just do a time check. How much time do we have left?
5 more minutes.
5 minutes. Well, I'm going to have to go to I feel like I almost have to go to the close. Yeah, so, because I want to at least give time for one question. I'm going to take 7 minutes. Can I take 7? Because I want 2 questions. Okay, we're going to be a grab bag. And I've got questions on culture, I've got questions on revenue synergies. If you promise to really answer them specifically, we can maybe even cover 3, but 2 people per question. You can just raise your hand with your... First one is, so much about diligence, whether it's especially private equity and corporates, is about cost. Like, how can I improve performance cost-wise? And over the years, revenue synergies have gotten such sort of a bad name. Some companies don't even want to include them when they think about synergies. What are the ways you can test if there really are synergies, that is revenue improvements or some revenue uplift to the revenue line? What are the things you would test? How would you test it? What are you looking for? Revenue uplift.
Can I start? Can I?
Sure, go.
Okay. Well, much of what we do is metric-based, so that you actually have to have measurements to demonstrate exactly what you just said. They're not ambiguous in any way. So one answer would be risk mitigation. If you're not getting fines and things like that, that's one measurement that you can use. But customer retention, customer satisfaction, and of course Lean Six Sigma, which is a huge thing that we work in that's been championed over the years by GE, Motorola, is exactly a cost reduction system to achieve perfection as much as possible.
Anybody else on revenue uplift? Remember, revenue is P times Q. So how am I either going to get more
So
P or
from
more
a real estate perspective, we keep data by vertical, by industry. So we're looking at what percentage of revenue are you operating in? If you're at 8% of revenue in your real estate and your competitors are 3 or 4 or 5, doesn't matter how many widgets you sell or product, it's really difficult to stay competitive and report those net earnings.
Good, thank you. 2 more questions. Do you want to address revenue? Okay, great. So I got to throw this in here. I've been for 20 years, I've been a critic of that culture gets the blame for things that go wrong. And in fact, so many of the issues are really the price and the strategy up front, and happiest people can't magically create economic value. But I've learned over time how important culture can be specifically. But in your view, what are those specific culture issues you can test, that you can just see there's going to be problems? Are there very specific things you can see pre-deal around culture? And then what would those be? Anybody?
I mean, I can take some of that, particularly around a lot of the tech, telecom, media-related companies we deal with. It's often an entrepreneurial business that's private, being sold to the Oracles, IBM, Cisco's of the world. And so there, depending on which side one is on, a lot of it really is, to the extent one needs that core management team on a go-forward basis, which is often part of what's being acquired, how really committed are they, not only economically and are you giving them the right financial incentives, but how really committed are they to being part of a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate versus being, king of their own fiefdom. And that often is missed even with some of the savvier acquirers around that, and you end up with attrition right in and around or just after the transaction is completed. And I think that's something that we've seen in our experience that could use more rigorous review, frankly.
Yeah, maybe one other person, but if you could address, how do you retain them? How do you make sure they stay?
Kind of coming back to that cultural issue, about half, a little more than half of what we do is family-owned businesses, which can take on a dimension of emotion that a lot of other businesses don't have. They ran up the credit cards to build the company. They bootstrapped it from the beginning. They've made sacrifices where we had a client who had to choose one time whether to pay the mortgage on his house or pay the mortgage on the building for his company. And those challenges become pretty difficult emotionally in the culture. Now they're going to go from being a 7 million EBITDA company to a 30 million EBITDA company in 2 years, which actually happened to a company we sold 2 years ago. How do you maintain some of those fundamental cultural things, the love between the employees and their founder, and yet triple the size of the business, essentially, quadruple the size of the business and number of employees? They checked down, found the few things that made the company really great in its original culture, and then allowed the company to take on its own new culture while inculcating those few fundamental things.
That's a very good point. That's actually a great point. So I have one more question for the panel, and we'll open it up for one question from the audience. And this is to everybody, and I just want top of mind, the absolute deal. What are the non-negotiable in the kind of work that you do? Short answer. Non-negotiable deal breakers. When you run into it in the process of diligence, unless it can be resolved, it's a deal breaker. Top of mind deal breakers? Start late?
Here, yeah. A lack of leadership. If you don't have good leadership committed to something, it's non-starter.
Lack of controls, financial management, because then no one can predict.
What's a symptom of that? What do you when you see that? How do you see it? Leadership, I sort of get the sense. I mean, you can just talk to them.
Financial diligence, having as one of the examples where the CEO writing checks or credit cards that aren't tied in. All these things that seem really okay from the entrepreneurial management perspective, but when you layer that into an acquired target, it's do I really believe what's going on? Is this sustainable? Are they billing properly? And surprisingly for large companies, large mid-sized companies, it's still being done with Band-Aids and rubber bands and a variety of other things. So
thank you. Brent?
Chemistry. When the chemistry of the deal begins to break down, it's difficult to recover from.
I'm going to make you define that. So when you say chemistry, how would that?
So if it's a strategic deal, if the seller feels like his legacy is going to be lost, then the chemistry is going to break down. And if it's a sponsored deal, if it begins to feel like this guy is not really going to be my partner and I'm selling the majority of my company to him, then the chemistry is going to break down and the deal is not going to get done.
That's a good example. And how is that for a seller? Does that have any implication for you on the method of payment, whether they're taking stock or cash?
All of our deals are cash-driven deals, so it won't make a difference ultimately to an entrepreneur.
Gerard?
A mandate, a vision, a clear direction.
So an example of that would be?
We want to be this. Tell us how to get there.
I had another question I was going to ask, and it's become popular, as sort of concept 20 years ago. Now everybody talks about the investment thesis of a deal, and I think that's often what we're looking for, an investment thesis. Like, forget about whether you even have a strategy to do it. Do you have a clear vision of what it is you're trying to accomplish by doing it? Because then it's testable, right? So without that, you don't even have an investment thesis.
Well, that's really why you're investing, right? So
Yeah, presumably.
I completely agree with the last point made. Without a clear point of view on what you're going to do with the investment, it's tough to get comfortable to put the money to work. I'd say the other situation is, as you look at the different scenarios that could unfold around an investment, understanding how you can get your capital out under various scenarios is pretty important to deciding to put your capital in the first place. And where we've gotten uncomfortable is when we can't figure out a way to get our capital out in most scenarios.
Great. So I think we have time for one or two questions, and then I'll just wait till they say we don't have any more time. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yes, I heard you talk a lot about protecting capital. being that it is extremely important to you, and then looking at the real estate side of the equation, how do those two play together?
I think that question was for you.
So I'm trying to understand your question. It's protecting the downside and a view on real estate and how that folds
Right, you
into.
talked about protecting capital, so I'm wondering what the relationship to protecting capital and being as real estate seems to be sort of a, different than the rest of the moderators. How do you handle real estate? How does that help protect capital, or how do you see that happen?
Well, I mean, obviously, if it's something you can monetize, it creates a vehicle, if you will, at least one lever to get your capital back out. And even if the business is performing well, I think you want to look at ways that you can create liquidity for yourself, whether you're trying to protect the downside and get your capital back, or frankly, trying to create some liquidity for the business to execute a growth strategy. Real estate's a key component to that. This is an area where we do leverage third parties to help us take a view on the value of real estate, the competitiveness of the leases, et cetera, for precisely the reason that or the question that you just asked. In a situation where we need to create liquidity for ourselves, is there some value there?
And if I could just add to just underscore your point, it's proactive management of those assets.
One more question, and I'm actually going to ask one final question if it's okay, because I think everybody wants to know the answer.
Quick question for Redwood. You mentioned a little bit on some of the hydro technology deals. Could you speak a little bit about to help de-risk a solution about earnouts and the acceptability and flavor and to what extent can you get earnouts?
Sure, it's a great question, particularly in high growth tech companies. It's often used as a tool when there's a material spread on the bid and ask on the valuation. That's not uncommon because if it's an entrepreneurial business, there's a stronger conviction around what the next 12 or 18 months will look like. The buyer will then turn around and say, well, management, if you really believe you can do that, I'll pay you X now and Y if you actually deliver. That all sounds great. The issue always is measurability. And is it a financial metric? Is it a unit metric? Is your business unit being folded into, again, I'll use a generic IBM, Oracle, Cisco group where their sales force is actually selling a lot of your product as well? And so how do you disengage value out of the buyer versus what you've done? And so in theory, it's a great way to solve a bid-ask spread on a deal value. In practice, they're extremely hard to negotiate and structure. And I've done it numerous times, and it often 3, 6, 9 months into the deal ends up in tears or conflict through no fault of either side, just because of the complexity of tracking how all that works.
Well, and then experienced buyers with an inexperienced seller, they're very good at these agreements. And so I'm going to ask one last thing, because I think everybody wants to know, when you're dealing with what seems to be an overly motivated seller, what are the things that you look for where a seller may be trying to hide something? What are the common things, the types of diligence you do? What are the things that are just so common that they're common places that something's being hidden? Everyone like that question? Is that a good closing kind of question? 5:15 in the afternoon.
Can we start on that side?
Yeah, let's start on this side.
Can you ask the question?
Oh yeah. So whether they're highly motivated or not, and I'll give you my answer from a commercial standpoint. But what are the things that are being hidden? What are the kind of things that a seller might try to hide, whether even they realize it or not? But intentional or unintentional. But what you do, what are some of the hidden problems that?
Well, I mean, obviously they're trying to present the business in the most optimistic light that they can. So in that sense, they're hiding a lot of things across a lot of different functional areas.
Give me one example.
Well, I mean, it could be some environmental liability. It could be some, pending HR liabilities. There could be some cultural dysfunction that they don't really want to give you some visibility to. It's really up to the buyer to conduct their diligence in a way to minimize and bound that risk, wherever that risk may be, and get comfortable pressing forward.
Good, thank you. Go.
For us, it's typically an environmental issue or a latent defect or some credit issue or securitization issue. that comes in.
Great, thanks. Brent?
We're on the buy side on a deal like this now, where the seller is overly optimistic and very aggressive. And what we decided to do is to bolt down the four corners of the business that really make the business run. They're responsible for 95% of the revenue of the business, and they're very easy to track through diligence. And if we can nail those four corners down, then whatever he's hiding at least is not materially going to injure the business, because there are not that many other moving pieces.
I agree with one of the earlier panelists on it could be a myriad of issues. One thing that we see is to slow the pace of diligence down, and we're actually seeing exclusivity periods in deals stretch out versus the good old days.
Yeah.
It used to be 30, 45 days. We're now seeing up to 90 days of exclusivity, and part of what you're doing there is, if there is a latent issue, it will surface. A customer's about to leave, there's an HR issue, there's something else going on. If one waits it out, 2-3 months, it will surface, and that way you don't have to hunt and peck. You let it, and if it goes smoothly, you've had that extra time to kind of be more thorough around some of the issues, no matter what they may be on the diligence side.
That's a great answer. Lee?
On-site assessments are a very large part of what we do, and what I find is that we're given by the auditee a specific person to talk to who knows everything and everything is going great and goes out of their way to avoid letting us talk to the rank and file so that we can really find out what's going on. So I have to get past that with my experience, and that's what I do.
Got it. So I'll just give you mine, sort of one of these trap doors you often see. Do you think companies would, selling companies would understate or overstate their market share? What do you think? Under or overstate? No, they have an incentive to understate their market share, right? Because when you're looking at the valuation, if you understate your market share, you've got more headroom for growth, right? And it's not uncommon when we do commercial diligence on a deal, when you actually look at the addressable market, the actual addressable market for that product, you look at their share, it's greater, sometimes twice as great as it is in the management presentation. And how does that impact your valuation? That headroom for growth is a lot lower. That would be kind of the thing. That's the first thing we look for, is what's the true market share of that company in their market, where you value it. Anyway, thanks very much. I really appreciate the participation today, and thanks very much for the panel. That was great.